And we're live. All right, so just to catch up on some things, I'm going to be, in the next couple of days, replacing this front screen that has our schedule, because obviously we now know when everything is. We know that the final exam, or sorry, I should say exam 3, is a week from today, same time, same place. I will be replacing this with the grading scale. So the grading scale, you can also find that grading scale on in the syllabus, page 4. So here's the syllabus. Go down to page 4, and you'll see this. But I'll go ahead and I'll put it front and center as well. So here's the grading scale. So keep in mind, it's a points-based course. Now, I believe that the gradebook already includes percentages, and I think those are pretty accurate to my grading scale. But just to be on the safe side, I suggest adding up all of your points and then going over here to the final course grading scale and then seeing where that goes, seeing how many points you get. And so the gradebook is complete. We've got except discussion 5, discussion 6. All of those will be added as they catch up. We got the free point activities, but in general, these you should all know already whether or not you got them. I mean, it's pretty much low-hanging fruit, these assessments. The country profile option 3 has been graded for everybody. It includes a few you sent me via messages. Finished them off this morning, so everything is up to date except for these here. But those are very simple items. You should already be able to know and expect what you got based on this is a grading on completion. So simply add up the total points that you've earned, and then go ahead and add what you think you'll earn on exam 3, and that should be somewhere on that grading scale there. So essentially add up all the total points you've earned, add up these that you think you'll get, which once again, these will be added quite soon. Then that exam 3 grade. So I got this question, I don't think it was anyone in this group that was also confused as far as where all the grades are located. The grade book, on-course grade book. So you'll see all of that there. I don't think it's anyone in this class. But once again, exam 3 will be added. And that one, I'll probably fit. I'll those graded by Thursday. I can get those done in no time. So all that I'll make announcements about next week. So once again, the grading scale, points-based, find the total points and include these in there, and you should find your grade. Other things to mention. The country profiles, now looking back at them at a whole, were once again better than they've ever been before, so I don't know what's going on there. I guess less of me means more of you. I don't know, so I don't know what's going on. Maybe it's applications, we're just getting better students, but they were very, very good, and just a few that are under 30. So we had, I think 3 or 4 40s. But I will also, in the next couple days, I'll assemble all of the grades so you can see where you fit in compared to everyone else. And so I'll make sure I also note the different options that people did. So that will be some data that I'll help you see how you kind of fit amongst your peers for the country profile option. But like I said, just a few under 30, so they were really, really good. Other things, gradebook, assignment, let's roll. All right, so the exam 3 review guide. And so once again, I have a recording of this. This is being recorded. I did go through and note where each of these are found within the chapters and add some extra bits if I left that at home. So as we go through each of these questions, I'll be able to further kind of say, well, this is what you want to look for. This is where you're going to find it. Make sure you take a look at this video that's also included. So I'll try to do that as we go through each of these questions. Cool. Fire away.
Is describe the Kabir or Rabi, is that one of the videos or is it like
Yes. So you're going to find the, let's go ahead and talk about that one. So urban slums, this is in chapter 12. You're going to find this towards the end. So right before gentrification, I believe. So somewhere in there is a thing on urban slums. Now first off, I guess a big picture thing is what's different between urban slums and, so it's this urban slums, the difference between them in developed versus developing countries. What's the big difference between urban slums in developed countries versus urban slums in developing countries? What's the big difference? Type of housing? Well, you could say that, but in both cases, they're the less desirable housing. So we can use broad terms to say, well, both of them are found in the least desirable areas, often temporary housing, often inadequate sanitation, and all of those. So both of them have those that are similar.
Is it the developing are on the outskirts, whereas the developed inside?
Okay, so that's another one. You obviously you know your stuff. So developing, we are finding that the urban slums are more on the outskirts of a city in developing countries, where in developed countries they're kind of an inner ring. So you have your downtown areas, you have your suburban areas. In developed countries, they're kind of somewhere in between that. So there's a geographic difference between them. But the big difference is one of them is declining in terms of population. People are moving out of urban slums in developed countries, whereas in developing countries, through the roof. Steroid. Go ahead, add steroids to that. We're talking huge growth. And so where is population growth happening the fastest in the world? Developing countries in their urban areas, even more so in their urban slum neighborhoods. So that's the big difference. And so it's focusing on developing countries. And so in the video that's included in the urban slums in developing countries, you're going to see me kind of go through a series of different images, but I will focus in somewhere in that video. I do focus somewhere in on that video on Dharavi and Kibera. So when you answer this question, just pick one. Pick one and go nuts on it and tell me all about that particular urban slum. So let's start off with Kibera. Kibera is an urban slum there in Nairobi, Kenya. And so one of the things we're going to find often characteristics of these countries and places where you find urban slums in developing countries is a primate city dominates. And so in the case of Kibera, it's an urban slum in the primate city of Nairobi. As far as what's going on there, living conditions in Kibera, it's along a floodplain. So you'll find that these are not the most desirable areas. And so floodplains, as the name implies, flood a lot. So what happens if you get a lot of rainfall, which is customary in the tropical rainforest area or the nearby tropical rainforest, they'll have these huge amounts of rain. It'll flood their entire village. And when you have no sanitation, all that then gets mixed together. All that becomes, moves over into maybe where you live. And then eventually it retreats. The river will go back to its normal spot. But in Kibera, the river, the floodplain area, is the least desirable area. And some pretty stark, profound images when you look at the aerial of Kibera. You'll see how compact it is. How it's just houses and squatters right on top of each other. But on the other side of the fence, huge golf course, huge luxury condo facility. And so you definitely see the stark contrast between the wealthy and the not so wealthy in Kibera. So that's the living conditions. You're also compared to Dharavi. I don't know if you look at the images. I mean, you see, the walls of the homes are earth, mud, or maybe it's corrugated steel, maybe tarps. So not the best housing. Very, very cramped quarters. So obviously not the best living conditions. So contributing factors. This is, a lot of the stuff builds on other topics and other stuff. So I might mention this later on when we talk about other questions. But in the case of Kibera, but also in Dharavi, one of the things that's adding to this increase is the fact that railroads go from the rural areas to the urban area. And so what's happening here is in these areas, which also the railroad goes right through. Once again, railroads aren't typically where people like to live. So the railroads come right through the urban slum area. So what they do is they essentially are a one-stop shop, one-way ticket for people to hop on legally or illegally and take a ride for the city. So we look at the contributing factors. Why are urban slums in developing countries, why are they growing so much? One reason is the roads and the networks kind of cause that. They bring everyone to that one dominant city in a particular country. In the case of Kibera, it's Nairobi. In the case of Dharavi, it's Mumbai, India. So that's one contributing factor. Another key contributing factor in the case of Kibera is kind of when we think about these areas, and there's this kind of misconception There's this woman named Sally Struthers who had a commercial in the 80s and 90s. Maybe some of you remember, for the price of a cup of coffee, you could feed this child.
Yes.
And it has a child is sitting there with flies hitting. In perception, that's what urban slums are like in these developing countries. Not so fast, my friend. In fact, you're going to find in these particular areas a very thriving economy. There's management people, there's middlemen, there's salespeople, people sell shoes, people make artwork. So what we have here is we have a very thriving informal economy. And so we think about these areas. One contributing factor is there are opportunities. Informal economy. And so that goes way back into the global economy. The formal economy is regulated by the government, statistics collected, all that data is known, it's added to GDP, economic data for countries. Informal economy, under the table, the black market. And so in these particular areas, what's contributing to the growth is the fact there are jobs there. Most people think there's no jobs in urban slums, but actually people are moving there for economic opportunity. People are moving there, sometimes with the false hope that it's going to better their lives. It's going to help, they're going to send that money back to their kids, so their kids can have a better life. And so another key contributing factor is the informal economy, which is there and thriving. And so when we think about these places, it's that perception that people are just sitting around waiting for aid to come to them is not at all the case. There is an economy there. It's just one that you'll never find data on because it's part of the informal economy. Other things to mention with Kibera, look at sanitation. You'll come across a term called the flying toilets. If you watch that video, you'll also come across an example of how in Kibera, in the urban slum, people have to pay to use a toilet. You're thinking, wait a minute, that makes no sense. It's one of the poorest places in the world, and people have to pay to use the toilet. Here in developed country United States, push a button, it just disappears. That's also kind of that sanitation, how they kind of these stark contrasts that are mentioned in that Kibera case. All right, now with Dharavi. A lot of the similar characteristics, so I'll make this a little bit shorter. But Dharavi has a little bit of the higher technology in terms of the building. You'll actually see, structure, or maybe a little bit of foundation, but there's no doubt you see the same qualities as far as high density population. People living right on top of each other. So it's very, 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 very cluttered, very clustered, just high dense population. Also what you see there, similarly, you'll see railroads, you'll see trains helping them add to the growth of that particular area. Another thing you'll see in Dharavi more recently is what's also further adding to the kind of the close quarters is the fact that the government keeps on kind of taking away that area. When we think about these urban slums, no one owns the land, the government owns the land. So what happens is the government kind of says, all right, we're going to claim this area, we're going to re-irrigate it, we're going to put up these large, huge multinational corporation buildings, these business complexes. And so what's further adding to the density, increasing the density, is the fact that it's slowly kind of getting piecemealed further and further into smaller pieces, which is very characteristic of urban slums because nobody owns it. There might be a landlord, but it's not really a real landlord. So that's one of the other problems is there's no control. At any time the government can say, we're wiping this area out, and of course it's going to leave a lot of people without a place to live. And so that's Kibera and Dharavi. Once again, Kibera and Dharavi are really never mentioned in the text, but they are specifically described in the video that follows this section. They're in 12.5-ish maybe. Cool?
Yes.
Is it 12.5? Oh. Or you're just saying yes to
Yes.
somewhat being satisfied that the question was answered.
Yes.
Right on. All right, where are we going next?
We do the whole chart.
Sure, yep. Now, this one, it's the only one from chapter 13, so it's a guarantee that I'll probably be using this one. So very good that you asked that one because it will be on there. All right. So for this one, just got to make sure we understand the question, read it carefully. But the question, you'll see on the exam, you'll see this question, and unless you have huge handwriting, you'll be able to write in those boxes. And what I want you to do is for each of the 5 boxes, be able to write and fill in the term that should go there. All right, so the first one, what should go in that box? Human driving forces. This one, what goes in the box? Human activities. Middle one, environmental change. Fourth one, we'll just call it consequences. And then the last one, solutions. And so I like this because it's what they call a systems approach. But the idea here is one thing leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. And when we think about solutions, I argue we should come up with solutions for all of these different aspects, all these different individual boxes. So you'll get 1 point on this question for being able to fill in the boxes correctly. And if you want me to go through those again, I can go through. I'll just go through them real quickly. Human driving forces, human activities, environmental change, consequences, solutions. So that's 1 point. The remaining 9 points are 3 points each. And all that is just being able to explain the first 3. So it's all just related to explaining the first 3. And so I'll go ahead and do that right now. First off, human driving forces. So human driving forces, these are indirect impactors of the environment. So this is not where we see environmental change occurring, but these are things that will lead to environmental change. And so when you talk about the human driving forces, you have to mention the IPAT formula. So this IPAT formula is a good way to think about these human driving forces, these indirect impactors of the environment. In other words, first I'll just go ahead and flesh out this formula. Not too complicated of a formula, but I is environmental impact. So to understand our environmental impact, we have to understand that it's a combination of population. So the population increases, that means that it's going to increase the impact on the environment. A is affluence, and T, technology. Those kind of go hand in hand. Technology. And so pretty much in modern day academia and higher level or higher ed, pretty much you have to have a smartphone, you have to have iPad too, you got to have a laptop also, you got to have a flat screen TV in your bedroom as well. So we got to have all these various things that are needed. So of course that requires a lot more resources. So to flesh out this formula once again, environmental impact, as each of these increases, so will environmental impact. But at the same time, if any of these decrease, it's going to lessen environmental impact. So a baby being born isn't going to all of a sudden cause a tree to be cut down or a cow to all of a sudden start grazing a deforested pasture. But nonetheless, more people, more resources. So affluence. You think about the iPhone, I think what we have, the iPhone 15 now, iPhone 17, but pretty much, if the new iPhone comes out, we have got to be standing in line that night, wrapped around a Best Buy, waiting to get that brand new phone. We've got to have it. We can't live without it. So essentially this new. For me, my old computer that I had for 3 years from the school, I had to get rid of it. I had to go out and get a new one. I was happy with it. But every 3 years you get a new laptop, Andy. I don't want one. It's paying me more money. Anyway, sorry about that. So that is, another example of increasing affluence. So as more places across the world, as more people drive cars, more people can afford cars, more air pollution. As more people become more affluent, they eat more meat. More meat means more forests is cleared, so that then pastures can be put in their place and cows can graze. So affluence across the world, more people drinking water bottles. So something we think of water, it's just something that just comes free from nature, but it's actually now, of course, put into bottles, and across the world, people are drinking water bottles. So water bottles, that plastic comes from oil, petroleum based. Technology, affluence, they kind of go hand in hand, but just think of technology. One example would be the computer chip industry. If you look at all of our electronic gadgets, the key to them is the fact that they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller, lighter and lighter. What's key to that is computer chips are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but more powerful than ever. And so the production, the technology, to make that one computer chip, if it gets a little speck of dust, it gets a little contaminated, it's rendered useless, it's pointless, it's got no value, it's got no use because it won't work. And so there's so many resources used to keep that computer chip clean as it goes from production to assembly to being part of your iPhone. And so these are human driving forces. These are things that are indirectly leading to change, to environmental change, but it's not, a baby being born doesn't mean all of a sudden a tree being chopped down. So that leads us into our next box. So human driving forces, and this one, if you just focus in on the IPAC formula, you can go ahead and there's some shortcomings of this formula. You can talk about those too if you'd like. But that would be pretty much all you really want to focus in on for human driving forces is the IPAC formula and its shortcomings. So these indirect factors then eventually will cause environmental change. That gets us to the second box. Those are human activities. And in the context of this course, in the context of human geography, let's think of those as different economic sectors. So human activities, we'll think of primary sector activities. So like timber, obviously, is going to, is an activity. More people wanting paper, so there's going to be more timber, more forested areas being cut down. Going back to the meat example, what they're doing in Brazil, because all of a sudden everyone loves Brazilian meat, is they're just clearing the rainforest, they're clearing the forested area, and in its place putting in grass, so cows can then, of course, wobble around and eat grass. So that would be an example of primary sector. Agriculture is a great example. Mining, strip mining. Mountaintop removal, which they just kind of cut off the top of a mountain and then go out and dig out and get the good stuff, the coal, whatever. So those are what's the primary sector activities. When we think about secondary sector activities, think about factories. Just think about a smokestack, a factory, a manufacturing facility. Think about all the resources used to manufacture stuff. So of course, factories, air pollution, water pollution as they dispose of their waste. And so in the secondary sector, those are human activities which are leading to environmental change. So once again, primary sector, agriculture, huge amounts of environmental change there, mining, secondary sector, manufacturing, industry, heavy industry, but also secondary sector. If you think about secondary sector, and a lot of you might go into business, you might be traveling all over the world, a lot of resources involved in that. A lot of you will be in marketing and sales, in which the whole goal is to get people to buy more stuff, get people to consume more stuff, more resources. So in the case of those economic sectors, apply those to that human activities box. Next up, we have environmental change, and this is choose your own adventure. This is where you can talk and focusing on whatever environmental change you want, whether it be invasive species that aren't native, that are all of a sudden introduced to an area, just take over, destroy everything, like the kudzu. In Lake Michigan, they got some flying fish thing. It's a big problem. It's Asian carp, maybe. So it's an Asian fish that's brought over, and it's now causing huge problems in Lake Michigan. Environmental change, you can talk about deforestation of the Amazon. You can relate that to other things mentioned, related to the increasing demand for meat across the world. Environmental change, you can talk about air pollution, water pollution. And so that one's really choose your own adventure, to be able to explain environmental change and relate it to, once again, some human activities, and of course relate those human activities to those human driving forces. So in sum, for this one, just be able to fill in the boxes, and then you get 1 point for that, and then 3 points for being able to further explain human driving forces, 3 points for explain human activities, and 3 points for environmental change. And so in the textbook, if you go back to chapter 13, the environmental change is pretty much broken down into individual videos. Dam construction, invasive species. And so for that one, I don't know if there's much text. I think it's mostly going to be videos. Those videos are trying to make them a little shorter, which they're kind of talk about different types of environmental change. I believe that's towards the end of that chapter. Cool? Does that answer that one? Maybe? All right. Where are we going next? You see that?
I guess an idea of what to look, I haven't gotten into chapter 15 yet.
Okay.
So
All right.
that's electoral geography.
Yeah, let's just go ahead and talk. All right, for this question, I'll ask you either one or the other. So I'll either ask you the national level question or the Indiana specific question. But what's nice is the demographics are the same, but if the geography is different. So for the national level, you'll tell me different things. Well, along the big coastal urban areas and the rural interior is what you'll say for the national level trends. Whereas in Indiana, you'll talk, well, Marion County, the urban counties of Marion County and the Gary cluster, rural areas throughout most of the state, those young counties there and where colleges are. So these more apply them to the geography. But let's go ahead and talk about some demographics. And since most of you probably haven't started in on this, this could be news to you. Could be good for these. This is an all video chapter, so keep that in mind as you work on it. It's all videos. All right, so some demographics. We'll start with the demographics. So these are trends that we're seeing in the last few elections, and we can go ahead and say 2016 will be the same. Let's just start off with young people. Young people, more likely to vote Democrat. So the younger you are, more likely to vote Democrat. And of course, the inverse of this, the older you are, more likely to vote Republican. So, put that in the Indiana context. Where do we find young people in Indiana? Boom, urban areas and college towns. Or college counties, let's say. Since we use counties for the most part to show this pattern. So urban, so it's going to be Indianapolis, urban of course, Gary, Michigan City, Fort Wayne, but Fort Wayne is, if you look at the county as a whole, it's one of the biggest urban counties in the country that historically votes Republican. Jacksonville, Florida would be the biggest urban area that traditionally votes Republican, but for the most part, all urban areas, they vote Democrat. There are some exceptions to that, but so some urban places, like I mentioned before, in college, Bloomington, Terre Haute, Lafayette to a certain extent.
I don't see much of Lafayette though because it's very agricultural.
Boom, exactly. Lafayette's much more agricultural, so it means more students are coming from rural areas than let's say IU Bloomington. And so when we think about rural Indiana, much more Republican. So rural Indiana, very, very Republican. So in rural Indiana, you'll find much higher percentage of the population is old people. It's you've got the brain drain happening there. You don't have a few colleges scattered here and there. But most of rural Indiana, very Republican, and one key reason is a lot of old people. Now at the national level, you see the same trends as far as where we find Democrats in urban areas, college areas, and less likely in rural areas. All right, now let's do what are we going to do next? So we've done essentially age characteristics, but at the same time we also did urban versus rural, so kind of the urban geography characteristics. Now let's do ethnicity. So let's do Black/African American, Latino/Hispanic, Asian, and then white. All right. So in 2008 and 2012, African Americans voted overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate. Why is that?
Because he was black.
So of course. But with that being said, African Americans, on average, are much more likely to vote Democrat. This was before Barack Obama. This will be after Barack Obama. So much more likely to vote Democrat. Where in Indiana do we find African Americans?
Cities.
Urban areas. And so a lot of these overlap with each other, a lot of these relate with each other, but nonetheless, in Indiana, we do find African American populations in Gary and also in Marion County, so Lake County and Marion County, where Indianapolis is. Next up, Latinos and Hispanics. Go ahead, I'll just put this here. Question mark. Now, when we think about Latinos and Hispanics, this is the group where overwhelmingly the election will be focusing on in 2016. Why? This is the group that's up in the air. This is the group that changes. In 2000, they voted Republican. In 2004, 50-50. 2008, Democrat. In 2012, also Democrat. So of all the groups, of all the ethnic groups, this is probably the one that's more up in the air. The one that can go back and forth. Further, we think about how do places change. You know, Indiana really doesn't change that much. Most of the country doesn't change that much. How do places change? Migration. New people or people leaving, but in the case of Latinos and Hispanics, new people moving in. So we think about how and why areas change, focusing in on, once again, this immigration group, where they're moving to. Latinos and Hispanics are also going to be key to understanding the 2016 election. And this makes sense why the Republicans, you know, aside from Trump, are really seeing Cruz and Rubio, both Latinos, as attractive candidates. Because they're hoping, just how Obama won a large number of the African Americans, they're hoping Latinos will also vote in large numbers. That's why Jeb Bush has really, he's trying to emphasize the fact he's got a Latino son, a Latino wife, he speaks Spanish in some interviews. It's all trying to win votes. This is a contest. It's a popularity contest is all it is. And so Latinos and Hispanics, another reason why they're question mark, they live in rural areas, they live in urban areas, they live in suburban areas. And so there's really no geographic specific area in which they reside, unlike the other groups, which are a little bit more specific. Asians, yeah, also up in the air, not as much Democratic as blacks are, but nonetheless have, in the last few elections, voted increasingly Democratic. What's going on there? A few different things. One thing I hope I remember to mention here in a minute is the fact that where do Asians live throughout the United States? Two areas. Where do we find them? The coast, big urban areas. So urban areas, if they're not in urban areas, where do we find them? College towns. So those are, once again, areas that are typically Democratic voters. So Asians living there in urban areas, big urban areas on the coast, New York City, Chicago. You don't really find too many clusters of rural Asians. So some of the geography plays a role there. Finally, whites. Whites have historically, in the last few elections, voted Republican. So in 2008, 44% of whites voted for Obama, so he had less than the majority. And in 2012, he only had 40%. So we look at whites. So where do we find the whitest people in Indiana? I know that sounds bad. The highest number of white people in Indiana, rural. So once again, rural Indiana. So a lot of these overlap with each other, but that's fine. It's kind of building on concepts. Next up, let's look at education.
Talk about that one thing.
What's up? Yeah,
That's
me.
Okay.
So next up is education. So fascinating here. We look at education. No high school degree and postgraduates. Democrat. So essentially, those at the bottom of the education spectrum, people without high school degrees, more likely to vote Democrat. Those people, though, with the highest levels of degrees, PhDs, masters, research scientists, also more likely to vote Democrat. Those that are kind of high school, currently in college, college grads, a little bit more 50-50.
I think it depends on how you were raised.
It definitely does, no doubt about it, no doubt about it. So it's kind of an interesting pattern here, in which those at the bottom and those at the top are much more likely to vote Democrat. And so we think about these elections. These elections are going to be focusing in on those 50-50 areas. So, what's in between rural and urban? Suburban. So suburban areas are the focus. Certain states that are very middle average states, middle income, are always the swing states. When we look at education level, it's people who have recently graduated from college. Those are the people in which the campaigns are going after because it's groups that are 50-50. They're not going to go after groups that have no high school degree. They're not going to go after highly educated people because they're both Democrat. You're not going to win that group. And so it's going to be focusing on those 50-50 areas. In that case, college students, college grads are kind of that up in the air group. So going back to Asians, we think about Asians, they typically have the highest education levels, and so that would also kind of correspond to that democratic title that I've given Asians for the most part. There's some other things that are kind of interesting. There's male versus female, married versus single, but that really doesn't play itself out geographically. You're going to find some religion differences. So Catholics are a little bit more up in the air, a little bit more 50-50 compared to Mormons or evangelical Protestants, which are much more likely to be Republican. Jewish people, where do we find Jewish people? Where do they live? Urban areas. And so Jewish people are more likely to vote Democrat. And a lot of that relates to that urbanity there as well. So some of that religion I also mentioned in the videos and text, or videos, I guess. So those are other things you can mention there as well. But in terms of explaining the geography, I mean, college counties that are urban, that have a lot of young people, very much Democrat, whereas places that are really rural, that are less diverse, much more likely to vote Republican. And so I'm just going to fire up the book real quick, and I'll just take it to an image. It's at the end of the very last video, and it's a nice summary of kind of some research I did, but a nice summary of these patterns. And I'll go ahead and, while we've got some time to kill, what's the next question? Where are we going to go next?
Can we describe the criteria
Now
for
is
the of the state?
See, for
Just for clarification.
Okay, good.
On here.
All right, and so here is at the very end of the very last video, you'll see this. And so Republicans, smaller areas, smaller cities, rural, older, much more white, aka less diverse. More likely to be homeowners compared to apartment dwellers, which of course are much more likely to find in urban areas, and more likely to have higher incomes. So all of this is just summaries of data I collected from the state of Indiana, but this is just kind of, don't worry about the data so much, just kind of how I summarize the groups. I think that almost is a perfect summary of what I just wrote up here, the chicken scratches. All right, so next up is how to become a state. And we'll use it in the context of ISIS. Is ISIS a state?
I didn't know how to answer that. I really didn't.
Did I ask you that?
Yeah.
Palestine.
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 Well, that's the idea.
Yeah, I was just like, I don't feel like confident enough to answer this.
It's fine.
It's
I just
especially
use
when
video
like
as
some
examples
places
while I
do
have it.
view it and then other places don't. It's like
It's confusing. It's
Yeah.
not, I'm a mathematician. I love formulas. I'm like, there should be a qualification, but if you're in one state, it's whatever the state thinks of Palestine, whereas in a different state, they might think completely differently. So it's that point of reference. All right, so this is the question right here. Describe the criteria for the formation of the state. What are the 4 criteria?
has to be able to govern itself.
So the ability to govern itself. I love this word. It's my favorite word. I prefer calling it sovereignty. It sounds so much better than sovereignty. Sovereignty, it's spelled sovereignty, but sovereignty is this ability to rule over yourself. And you could say that ISIS does have that. ISIS is currently developing a Department of the Treasury. They currently have a Secretary of Education. I don't know how good they're doing. So they're actually trying to create some of those abilities to rule over themselves. They also have somewhat some police power. And so if you look at the checklist of is ISIS a state, or ISIL, whatever it's called, we could say for the first one, yeah, it kind of is actually. It does have the ability to rule over themselves. It does have some of those police power functions. It does provide some key things for the population. Like whether it be healthcare, education, treasury, although it's still got a long ways to go. What's the second key criteria, or the next one, let's say?
Does it have to be recognized?
Internationally recognized. So this is the last one and the most sticky, the most kind of confusing, but it's all about being voted into the club. And I don't know, I'm sure maybe there's like an Islamic country somewhere that recognizes ISIS, but I doubt it. If we look on Wikipedia, I doubt there's no countries that recognize ISIS as its own country. So right there, ISIS is not a state. It's not recognized by any other country of the world. But this can get confusing. Once again, it's all about where you're currently residing or the country you're from. So for example, the United States does not recognize Taiwan as a country. But you can go, to Pacific Island countries, a few Central American countries that do recognize Taiwan. They say Thailand, I meant Taiwan. So it's fuzzy. It's not neat. I wish it was better, but it's all about being voted in the club and having international recognition. Some would say UN would be a good, are you a member of the UN? But Vatican City's not in the UN, so it's kind of it's not perfect. But that is the last criteria, and some would say the most important.
Which I was going to ask on that, like when the UN decides, is there like a majority rule kind of thing?
Yep, it's the Security Council. So it's up to UK, France, United States, Russia, and China. And so that's where China has veto power. So China, at any time, can say, nope, Taiwan will never be added, because we say it's not going to be added. We have veto power. We can just our one vote can eliminate it. So that's the same. A lot of those Eastern European countries that are becoming new countries, kind of Russia is also kind of the key. And there becomes a situation where if Russia, views a country, an independent country, as becoming its own country, then these individual places within Russia say, well, what about us? And so it becomes a situation like that where Russia says, okay, we're not going to recognize them because there's people in our own country that want to be recognized, want to become their own country. They'll say, what about us? Similarly, China has Tibet. So they kind of had that same situation where at any time Tibet say, well, wait a minute, we have a lot of the characters. We should be our own country. And China says, no, we don't want to kind of start a trend, let's say. So we've got two reasons. Third and fourth reasons, they kind of relate to each other, but whatever.
They have to have borders that are not claimed by other.
So defined boundary, exactly, defined boundary. And ISIS really doesn't have a defined boundary. If you look at a map of ISIS, it looks kind of like splatter page. Somewhere in Iraq and Syria, it's not like one cohesive group. It's just a kind of a hodgepodge. So ISIS is really not doesn't have a defined boundary. So that's the second thing, the third thing, and the fourth thing, a permanent population and territory. And once again, ISIS doesn't have that. You've got so many people leaving that area, people coming in. It's this kind of area of flux. It's kind of changing its size. Its territory is changing. People on the move, not a permanent population. So in all those cases, we can kind of see, whether or not ISIS is a state, and overwhelmingly it's not. In that chapter 14, I introduced those key.
14.2.
What's that?
14.2.
14.2. And so I introduced kind of these ideas, these four different things, and then I also included video that specifically looks at different countries. So for that question, please include examples. Make sure to include those examples. That's where oftentimes when that question is asked, points are deducted, is people get so excited that they can explain those four, but then they forget to give me specific examples. In fact, you can give me fake examples. I don't know if I talked about it in the book, but Andy Stan. Did I talk about Andy Stan?
It was Andyland.
Andyland. You can talk about, Allison Land. But if it just showcases that you understand it, go for it. So real examples, whatever examples, just make sure you use examples to showcase that you understand the four criteria.
So we use the example of how it's not a state then?
What's that?
So we use the example how one is not a state?
Exactly, yeah. So you don't have to always say this is a state. You can say that because of this criteria it's not a state. So ISIS could be used in this example for sure. Kurdistan would be another one.
How many examples are you looking for?
2 to 3.
Okay.
Just enough that in your examples I can show that you know more than just the kind of the memorized formulaic notes. You can kind of apply them to some place is more what I'm looking at. Before. All right. Where are we going next? Residential segregation. All right. So when residential segregation, I believe this is all only mentioned in a video. So it's residential segregation. So chapter 11. So you'll find this exclusively in a video in chapter 11. But residential segregation. I stumble on those words because I prefer to say residential separation. So segregation and separation, not exactly the same thing. But when we think about, why do we have different groups living in different areas? It's almost kind of these separate areas. And so residential separation. So, in the United States, for the most part, we see residential separation. We see it in terms of income groups, which we really showcase there with the concentric ring sector, multiple nuclei, but also ethnic groups. So in the case of Indianapolis, it's pretty clear as far as where Latinos live, where Asians live, where African Americans live, and then, of course, in general, where whites live. So we do have, in the case of Indiana, in the case of Indianapolis, we do have residential separation, and it's mostly income and ethnicity. You go to Ireland, you go to the Iraq, you go to Iran, it's religion. Religion is the key as far as the separation into different groups, into different areas. And so we can think about residential separation, residential segregation. We can think of it racial, ethnicity separation, income separation, religious separation, maybe a couple more. But that's just kind of our starting point. So first off, when we talk about residential segregation, one term to use and maybe to further describe is something called the spatial mismatch. I make up the term, I make up the word, but I absolutely agree with the term and want to spread the word about it. And so what's happening in the United States is increasingly, because of residential separation, is spatial mismatch. And what's happening is low-income jobs are moving farther away from low-income people, which is a mismatch. Low-income individuals have less accessibility to a car, less accessibility to transportation, and so it's becoming increasingly more difficult for people in low-income areas to get to low-income jobs. So that's the key, is the spatial mismatch, in which low-income jobs are moving farther and farther away from lower-income individuals. So you go back to those earlier models, one of the things about the concentric ring model, one thing that was nice about it was low-income workers were living very close to where their low-income workplaces were. So that made sense. That was not a mismatch, but increasingly we see that mismatch occurring. Next up is as far as describing some specific examples of how residential separation occurs. So in that video I mentioned 3 different ways. The first one's called redlining. Now, it's not something that's used in reality today. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's not something that you see today. Let me step back. What is redlining? What it used to be was you would go into a bank, and the loan person, the person that distributes the bank, would have a map on the wall, and they would use, of course, a red line to map out an area. And if you were from that area, you could not get a loan. So this is something that you actually saw in banks way back when. Now, of course, today, those maps have been taken down, but still, in the people's in the minds, they still utilize this, we're not going to give you a loan because we don't like where you're from. We don't like, you're a green person. We don't like green people. And so redlining is an outdated, as an actual thing you'll see on a wall, but it's still in operation. And so what that does is, of course, it's going to restrict people's accessibility to getting a loan, to buy a house. So it further adds to separation, segregation. Next up would be something called steering. And it's kind of as the name implies. Let's say I'm a real estate person here in Indianapolis. You're a green person. You come to me and you're like, I really like those areas where all those purple people live. I will say, you know what? You're a green person. I think you might like it better over here. You steer them to a different neighborhood. Maybe, why would you steer? Maybe you have a lot of people who in that purple neighborhood who are your clients. And you don't want to piss off your clients. You don't want them, to be the client that brings in the green people into your neighborhood. So you steer them away. So steering, as the name implies, you kind of just steer people to where you think they would rather live, which further adds to separation of different groups, whether it be income, ethnic, whatever. The last one, blockbusting. Does anybody remember Blockbuster, the movie store?
Yeah.
Oh, never mind. So, all right. Not Blockbuster, the store, but blockbusting. All right. Let's see if I can. All right. So. All right. So here I am. I'm a developer, real estate person, whatever. So I'm in charge of this new subdivision, brand new subdivision. High-income homes. I'm going to make a lot of money if I can get people to move in there. And so what blockbusting is you might have, once again, the green people. They might live in this area. What you do is you start saying to these purple people, hey, why don't you kind of think about moving into this area? This might be a good area for you. What are the green people going to be doing? Oh no, here come the purple people. Let's get the hell out of here. Well, by just pure chance, I happen to have this new development here. Why don't you come on over and build in this new development where I have, and so now you kind of exclusively sell to the green people. And so what you're doing, when I'm the developer or the real estate person, I'm making money two ways. I'm making money by more people moving to my new development here, but I'm also making more money as I get people to move to this development. And you definitely see this in the case of Indianapolis. It's a term called white flight, which is very present here in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In which that's what developers would do. They'd build a brand new subdivision out in the suburbs, make it nice, attractive, and they would say, you might want to move out of here because it's starting to change. It's not going to be the same. So you kind of create this demand for your product, and so that's breaking up the block. Breaking up the block here is the idea. Breaking it up. So all of these, of course, are all atrociously bad, awful practices, but nonetheless helps to understand why we have residential separation here in Indianapolis. And there's more reasons than that, but that's three key reasons. Like I said, also mention spatial mismatch, because that's a key thing in today's contemporary city that we're seeing that I want more people to be aware of. So that's, what's happening is you're seeing more companies, for example, Angie's List and other companies that are seeing this as let's put in jobs in these particular areas that are low-income areas. Let's provide opportunity for people. Further, public transportation, it's slowly getting around. Right now it's kind of connecting the wealthy people there. The new red lines trying to connect wealthy people there in Meridian Street, Broad Ripple to downtown. Once again, does it help solve the problem of low-income areas and people getting to jobs? No. It's very much focused on getting people back and forth from nightlife districts more than anything. So the spatial mismatch is a key problem we have here in our own city, and it's hopefully something you'll spread the word about. Cool. Where are we going next?
So just for clarification,
Yeah.
gentrification is the opposite, where you're moving wealthy people back into these ones.
Yeah, they have the choice, but yeah, people are willing to move there. And so what's happening is these inner city, often abandoned areas are being fixed up. Let's go ahead and talk about that. So gentrification, where is it? Inner city areas that have been abandoned over time, vacated homes, vacated areas in which people are now repopulated. Okay, that's the quick 411. As far as who's doing it, there's two main ways. And so if this question is asked, make sure in terms of including definition, where it occurs, who does it, there's two main ways. Initially, the first wave is what we call, I call non-traditional households. So it might be a gay couple. It might be a young childless couple. It might be empty nesters, let's say. Let's step back to that. It's for the most part, it's childless couples and people trying to make some money. We call them speculators. So people that see, okay, if I help redevelop this area, I can now turn these $20,000 properties into $150,000 developments, projects, condos, whatever. So who does it? The initial wave, childless couples. Why? Why would childless couples find these areas attractive? These inner city abandoned areas. Why would they find them attractive?
No school.
no school. And so often these areas that are low income, that are abandoned, vacated, the schools, they're just in poor condition, bad situation, teachers not staying there, teachers moving out. And so, but if you're a childless couple, you could care less about that. That's not something you're really concerned with, of course, because you don't have a kid in the fight or the bone in the fight or whatever the figure of speech is. You obviously don't have a vested interest in the schools because you don't have a child. And then, of course, those flippers and speculators are part of that first wave. And so what happens over time? Areas start to change. That development starts to occur. There's that threshold time, the threshold period, where it's then the second wave of people who are like, okay, now that I think it's safe to live there, now that I think that it's cool to live there, now I'm going to move there. So that's your empty nesters. So people like my parents are now wanting to move downtown. They want to get out of their 3,000 square foot house that's got 5 bedrooms, just 2 of them. They want to get the hell out of there. It makes sense. There's no amenities. There's no nightlife in Greenwood compared to downtown and all the the culture, the bars, the nightlife, the music, and all of that. So that's seen as attractive. Also, young urban professionals, also known as yuppies. So young workers. If you're from Chicago, if you're from New York. You might not find the suburbs of Indianapolis attractive to live because you've never lived in the suburbs. You've always lived in an urban area. And so you're seeing, like Mass Ave and Fountain Square, those areas grow. And so this reminds me of when, I don't know if I mentioned this text, but when I first arrived here, there was a colleague of mine who was gay. So I asked him, I go, well, where's the gentrification occurring in Indianapolis? And he got real excited. I was like, no, I'm not. I'm just curious where gentrification's occurring. And when he says, well, we got ran out of Mass Ave. Now we're in Fountain Square. Now we're starting to get ran out of there. So the idea is that first wave, you're now seeing them starting to have to move because the second wave is coming in, driving up prices, not making it, as unique, as cultural as maybe it used to be. Now that, Starbucks is on every corner in these gentrified areas. So that's all right. So that's who, why. Now let's talk about the positive and negatives. These aren't mentioned enough. Everyone thinks that these are just nothing but positives. Gentrification is a great thing. Everyone gets excited. And it's got its reasons. Economic development, no doubt about that. Areas have changed. Massachusetts Avenue, about 3 o'clock in the morning, about 10 years ago, about 15 years ago, I was driving home from Broadway, my car somehow died. Right on Massachusetts Avenue. It was the scariest place to be. People coming out of nowhere, helping me, asking me for money and stuff. It was spooky. Now, it's all well lit, you got the dancing woman, it's just a completely different area. And that's great. Crime's gone down as well. Economic development's occurring. This area has been reinvigorated. But some negatives, which we've got to focus in on the negatives, and so if you answer this question, make sure you talk about the negatives, is first off displacement. Right here where we are, this campus displaced a huge number of people, huge number of lower income individuals. Massachusetts Avenue, a little bit of displacement, but what's happening on the near north side? That area with Fall Creek Place, there along where Ivy Tech is. Displacement's occurring. People are moving out. People no longer can afford to live in an area. So some have said that actually what's happening is gentrification. Places are getting less diverse. As these different waves come in, it's becoming a lot of suburbanites, a lot of people that have similar views on things, similar ethnicities, what have you. Other negatives. Has Indianapolis, has their crime rate gone down? I mean, I don't know if you watch the news at all, but crime rate as a whole, metro-wide, hasn't gone down. It's just essentially redistributed where that crime occurs, where that violent crime especially occurs. And so crime rates, while they might go down in these particular areas that gentrified, it doesn't mean the whole area is now seeing a change in terms of crime. Metro-wide crime rates don't go down at all. Other negatives.
Schools are still crap.
The schools are still crap. I've stepped out of that world the last 5 years, so I don't know how the charter schools are doing. I don't know if things are changing. I know Irvington's got a charter school; it's doing quite well, but Irvington's a little bit different in terms of its makeup. I don't know. I'm sure that's occurring, but I don't know what's happening. I know George Washington High School is doing pretty better than it was.
Doesn't take much.
That's because I took the principal to prom my senior year. Anyway. Any other negatives? Displacement's the big one. Places are becoming increasingly less diverse. We love diversity. We love diversity of opinion, different ideas. You know, look at the auto industry. When a bunch of old white males decide everything, look how that turned out. They missed the boat as far as what people wanted. People didn't want big, huge SUVs that just guzzle gas. People wanted different things. But anyway, diversity is a good thing. So that decreases the amount of diversity in these areas over time. So that's pretty much it, that one. I know that one was maybe not one you wanted me to flesh out that much, but I apologize. Where are we going next? Let's do one more.
The Africa one?
All right. Legacies of colonialism in Africa that remain critical to today. All right, so I definitely, as you maybe have come across, I'm not a guy that makes you remember dates, nothing like that. Here's one, though, that I do want you to know, and that's the Berlin Conference of 1884. Berlin Conference. Where's Berlin? Germany. So not Africa. So Berlin. So what happened was we had that first off that age of exploration in which these different European countries were sending off people, explorers like Marco, Christopher Columbus, all that whole age of exploration. Things changed though in the 1850s. That's when you start seeing this era of, imperialism, actually ruling and claiming area, drawing boundaries. That's a new thing. Well, that was seen at the time as being different than the previous era, which is all about exploring places and finding new places and things. And so the Berlin Conference, what happened was the European countries, European powers, they came together, and they actually get, this is kind of a rough illustration of it, but it was like the draft, like the NBA draft, the NFL draft, in which they had a big map of Africa. They would come up one at a time. Okay, England says, all right, we want that area. France goes, okay, we want this. And then Portugal, we want this. Belgium, we want that. And what they did was they divided up Africa. And so this is a big word. They superimposed the boundaries on the African continent. Now, this has also happened in other areas, Latin America as well. Asia as well, but I like to focus in on Africa, this one continent. This is absolutely important. So what they did is essentially they just plopped lines on top of a map with no regard for actually the people, the culture that has been there for thousands and thousands of years. And so let me step back. Before the 1800s, Africa was an area of innovation. It's where inventions were occurring. It's where advancements in music, technology, science, mathematics was occurring at a huge, just as much as any other place in the world. You look at today, that's obviously not the case. So what happened? What caused that change? Africa and Zimbabwe, and after they're trading with China back in the 1500s, what happened was the Berlin Conference had superimposed these boundaries on top of the African population. So for example, you might have an area, a unified area, and all of a sudden a straight line was drawn to separate them. And so now you've got this area that's always gotten along, might be multiple groups, always gotten along, now split apart. Other examples, you might have this, the Socials and the Greasers, the Patriots fans and Colts fans, groups that have never gotten along, the Jets and the Sharks, whoever. And so now these groups that have never gotten along are now part of the same colony, competing for jobs, competing for different stature in the government. And so these groups that never gotten along are now these conflicts even further intensified. Further, you got a lot of migration, a lot of nomadic hunters and gatherers, especially in this time. And so their whole existence has been kind of making this, this seasonal migration from one place to another. All of a sudden, they get to this newly formed boundary in which this guy has a gun and says, "You're going to have to turn back the other way." So migration routes suddenly cut off. So all these boundaries, which are, for the most part, a lot of them are geometric boundaries, straight lines on a map. And every time you see a straight line on a map, a human drew that line. Essentially what they did was rip the areas together. They're always living in harmony. Forced groups that never gotten along to compete for jobs. This essentially caused disarray, because before this whole era, the Berlin Conference, Africans didn't have a view of the world as, okay, here's my area, over there's your area. It's a completely new idea, the whole idea of borders and boundaries and areas. This is mine, that is yours. And so that was brought with them, brought with the European colonial powers. And so what else do we have? we think about why were the European countries there? Resources. And so essentially we think about Africa. We go back to assignment 2. Was any of our stuff manufactured in Africa? Nope, not really. Africa is historically heavily primary sector. When did that come to be? Back when the European colonial powers essentially divided up Africa, it was all about resources. Could be in some areas rubber, other areas diamond, other areas oil, other areas gold, timber, Liberia timber. So whatever the resources was, it was all about getting resources from that area in Africa so that it could be then manufactured somewhere else. So we look at Africa. Why do they have the resource curse? Why do they have such a heavily primary sector economy? It all relates to the dividing up, the scramble for Africa by these European colonial powers. Further, kind of related to that, is the infrastructure. So the infrastructure, we think about, this is just kind of a model here. But let's say we have a country, we've got the shoreline over here, so over here's water. Essentially, the European colonies, they're smart. I mean, as far as what they want, they just want to get resources to a particular, somewhere else where they can be manufactured. And so what the railroads were was kind of set up to bring resources from the interior and typically to one dominant city. And over time, of course, that one dominant city becomes a primate city. So a lot of those primate cities of the world were way back when they were essentially distribution depots, is all they were. So these railroad tracks are essentially all focusing on taking people from the rural areas to one dominant city. So we look at the infrastructure throughout Africa, throughout countries of Africa, but throughout the entire continent, you don't see much intra-country travel. Everything is geared up to get resources from the interior. So you might have a country over here in which it's completely separate, a different pattern. And so you don't have much intra-country transportation. Now that's starting to change, but the infrastructure left everything back in terms of these railroads all leading to that one dominant city. Now I go back to urban slums in developing countries. What's adding to that population growth is how everything is set up. People just ride these trains to that key dominant area and, of course, move into the urban slum with the hopes that it's going to bring them economic growth. So the infrastructure, not set up for the continent, for interactions within the continent, is all set up to get resources out so that they can be then manufactured somewhere else. Finally, corruption. So the European leaders, while they were ruling over these areas, they weren't the best. They were very corrupt. So essentially what happened was they used violence as a means to achieve a lot of their objectives or their ends. So a good example, or a bad example of this, is a guy named King Leopold. Did I ever talk about King Leopold?
King Leopold.
I did? Okay, I'll give the Cliff Notes version. But King Leopold was from Belgium, and he used the Democratic Republic of Congo as his own personal state. The resource there was rubber. And so in the early 1900s, rubber was huge. It was like the iPhone. Because what it was is it just revolutionized transportation, of course. Rubber tires, of course, made transportation much easier than the old wooden wheel. But anyway, so rubber was going through the roof. So he took advantage of that because there was a lot of rubber in the DRC. So what he did was he started to develop his own militia, his own military to rule over this area. And so what he did was he said, okay, I don't want you wasting any bullets. I don't want you wasting any ammunition. So every single bullet that you're issued, you need to bring back a hand with it. With the idea that you're using violence to achieve your means. You're using violence to rule over this area, to take control of this area. And so within the military, it became a currency of hands. Because it became something of value when people were bartering and trading. Very sick, very distorted view of power and control. So all of a sudden, King Leopold leaves in the middle of the night. New leadership takes over. Who have they been looking up to over the last 50 years? Who have they been looking up to as the leadership, the qualities of a leader? King Leopold. And so a lot of that corruption, we can say, is the legacy of those European colonial leaders, and they obviously weren't thinking about the best interest of the African population. So still to this day, we see a lot of corruption. And of course, it also relates to control of resources and power and land and all of that. All right, so I'll take your photo. It's the 8. It's the 8 that are always here. The grade 8. Yeah, the grade 8. There we go. So if you have any more questions, send me an email. At any time, I'll try to answer it as soon as I can. So So I'll see you Wednesday at 3 then, I think.
They were Monday.
I mean,
Monday.
if you want to make it Wednesday. Well, no, I have the exam at 3:30.
Monday's fine.
Oh, is it Monday?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I was surprised.
That's
to
right,
send
that's
it Today.
Yeah. Well, nice. That's good. So I'm done earlier. All right.
Awesome.
Yeah, so whatever, it's on the syllabus, yeah, I'll be here.
There were a couple discussions that aren't on the radar.
Yeah, yes, discussion 5, discussion 6.
Yeah.
And remaining frequent activities, those will be added
Okay.
the next couple of days. Those, pretty much, go ahead and think of you getting full credit for those, because, I mean, they're just basically do the work, you get full credit. So I expect the discussion 5s probably by Friday, and then probably the same day for discussion 6. Discussion 6 is really, really easy and great.
I am in no way complaining. You're probably the best black professors this semester at getting the grades up. I was just wanting to make sure.
Yeah, last couple of weeks have been
Well, you've been busy. I understand.
Yeah, how was the old wedding?
fantastic.
Oh.
Are you doing
Absolutely fantastic.
IUPUI? That's why you got a new job?
What's that?
Are you doing IUPUI? That's why
Yeah, we'll
you.
see.
We'll see.
I don't know.
I told Greg
It's
that
a
you.
bargain. I'm using it more of a bargain.
Ah.
Narcotic.